WWE is the most criticized professional wrestling promotion in the entire world. It is safe to say the number one thing WWE is always criticized for is the way it books its current wrestling roster and builds up the next generation of superstars. WWE fails to create new stars, have storylines and matches that make sense, and give fans long lasting memories for generations. Now, there are moments that have happened within the last 5 years, but those are few and far between. One moment I can think of off the top of my head is Bianca Belair versus Sasha Banks for the SmackDown Women's Championship as the main event for WrestleMania 37 Night 1. WWE has had so many great wrestlers that they refuse to do anything with, and it is beyond frustrating at this point. Ricochet and Mustafa Ali are common names brought up that WWE just absolutely refuses to push and do things with. That, however, is going to be another video for another time. In today's video, I'm going to be re-examining the women's evolution in a long video series where I take apart everything that is and has happened in the WWE during this time to see if the effects of it are still present, and if not, what happened. In this video, I'm claiming that the women's evolution is currently in a horrible roundabout situation and it doesn't look like it will be improving anytime soon. But before I begin explaining myself and my hot take, we have to start at the beginning and how the women's evolution came about. Shortly after WWE went at PG in 2008, women's wrestling was portrayed differently than in the days of the WWF. In the WWF, China was wrestling men frequently and often had won many titles that were traditionally in the men's roster. Jacqueline is also another woman who wrestled men and even captured a man's title. Male on female violence and vice versa were common in the WWF because it was an edgy product. However, in the WWE, that was stopped. Women could no longer wrestle men, and there were very rare instances where men were attacked by women and vice versa since then. Beth Phoenix and Karma were the only two women to enter the Men's Royal Rumble between 2008 and 2019, along with Nia Jax. At this time, women were portrayed under the male gaze, which meant that they were to be the damsel in distress for most of their storylines, and often were used on television for their looks and their attractiveness rather than their wrestling ability. Tamina, Natalya, and Kaitlyn are noticeable exceptions to this rule. The WWE Divas Championship was and still is a joke to this day. Not many people took that belt seriously. Women's matches were barely given any time, and most of them were dubbed restroom breaks by the WWE Universe because no one took them seriously and they were quick and short. Tired of the mistreatment the women were getting, fans began tweeting under the hashtag #GiveDivas This single hashtag was trending for months and months, which prompted many people to turn their eyes to the issue of women's wrestling in the WWE. Articles began criticizing the WWE for the mistreatment of women and who were or being portrayed as damsel in distresses and needing a male savior, and this garnered national attention. A lot of this criticism came from mothers who watched this supposed family-friendly product and saw how the portrayal of women did not match up with this standard. Despite the criticism, WWE continued as if nothing was wrong. Every time we shouted, "Give us women's wrestling," they told us no. So if WWE seemingly ignored all of this criticism and refused to give us a proper women's matches as the norm, what was it that really sparked this change? In 2010, Triple H and Shawn Michaels launched NXT, which was their developmental brand, and from there was a shift in focus of both men's and women's wrestling. Triple H took a lot of men and women from the indie scene and brought them in and built them to be the next big things in the company. Triple H had a vision, and that vision was to build the next generation of superstars within the WWE and understood the weakness of everyone on his roster. He built up multiple superstars from scratch and built them in a way that WWE should be doing with new stars like NXT 2.0 that they failed to do right now. On the men's side, to showcase this success, we have Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens, along with Seth Rollins, are great examples of this formula being successful. On the women's side is where you have the four horsewomen in Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and Bayley. In NXT, these women were changing the game. Sasha Banks and Bayley especially were the ones that elevated the roster for NXT. These classic NXT Women's Championship matches and NXT TakeOver Brooklyn is one of the greatest wrestling matches of all time for both Sasha and Bayley, and also in the history of professional wrestling. And it also showcased what women's wrestling is and should be. If you have not seen this match at all, you need to. I believe that this match right here is what kickstarted the women's evolution. In 2015, Stephanie McMahon came out on an episode of Raw shortly after Nikki Bella became the longest reigning Divas champion, which was something you looked at and laughed at because it perfectly represented the women's division at the time. However, she addressed that they needed to be a change, and Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and Sasha Banks made their debut, signifying that this change was in full swing, and so was the women's revolution. The women were put at the forefront and had longer matches and were consistently on pay-per-views, or premium live events as they are now called. In 2016, Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and Sasha had a match at WrestleMania 32 to crown the first ever WWE Women's Champion, introduced by Lita on the pre-show. The match, in my opinion, wasn't their best match in their careers, but it did what it needed to do, and Charlotte Flair made history. After the brand split and SmackDown became an official second brand, Becky Lynch became the first ever SmackDown Women's Champion. On Raw, Charlotte Flair and Sasha would have many historic matches for women, such as the first Hell in a Cell with women competing in it, the first ever Iron Woman match on the main roster, and the first ever Women's Falls Count Anywhere match on Raw. On SmackDown, we would see the first ever Women's Money in the Bank ladder match with Carmella winning it due to controversy. The following SmackDown, which at that time would have been on Tuesday, Carmella would win it again in a second Women's Money in the Bank ladder match to become the first ever two-time Money in the Bank winner. From then on, we would get first ever Royal Rumbles for the women, the first ever Elimination Chamber match for the women, the first ever Women's Tag Team Chamber Elimination Chamber match, for the brand new women's tag team titles that were introduced, and a lot of other matches I will talk about in a video later on in the series. Now, when I say some of these historic matches are historic, I do it with rose-colored glasses on, because at the end of the day, we now have retrospection and can look back at a lot of these historic matches. And when I really think about it and analyze and see how these historic matches propel women now in the company, I disagree with a lot of the matches that have happened. Now, when I think of all the historic things Charlotte Flair and Sasha Banks have done, we can't say that for a lot of other women during that time. I mean, from 2016 to 2017, it felt like the only important women on Raw was Sasha Banks and Charlotte. Other than those two, I can't think of a single woman who did anything worth nothing. I mean, I believe Bayley was on Raw, and I'm pretty sure somebody did something. But other than that, I can't really say who really helped that brand during this time. On SmackDown, it was kind of the same thing. But here, we didn't have a clear woman who was the face of SmackDown, like Sasha and Charlotte were the faces of Raw. I mean, we did have noteworthy feuds in 2016 to 2017, like Nikki Bella and Natalya, and Becky Lynch and Alexa Bliss, and then Naomi and Alexa Bliss. But other than that, I can't think of a single feud that, was really the big thing. And speaking of Naomi, ever since she lost the SmackDown Women's Championship at SummerSlam against Natalya, she just never recovered. It's just like she never recovered. Well, sure, she was in a lot of history-making matches and became the first ever Women's Battle Royale winner. It was like, really, WWE didn't have a plan for her. That's what I like to see now. We have a clear direction for her. She's in a long-term storyline, and I guarantee you that if Naomi is not SmackDown Women's Champion again in 2022, I don't know. I just don't know with this company anymore. She absolutely needs to become champion again because she absolutely deserves it. Now, It was only in 2018 where women were introduced and brought up from NXT, like Ember Moon, The Iconics, Sonya Deville, Mandy Rose, and a returning Paige and Mickie James, did things really start to get going. Now, when it comes to the women's tag team elimination chamber match, we do have to talk about it because not only has WWE got non-existent tag team division for the women, but the fact that all the women that have ever held the tag team titles or have been in that elimination in chamber match have either been let go, split up, or I don't know what a third option would be because I can barely remember half the people who were even in the elimination chamber match for the tag team championships. Now, to show what I mean by this, let me give you some examples. We have the Iconics, former women's tag team champions and participants in the women's tag team elimination chamber match, and they were fired in 2021 due to budget cuts. Now, Shayna Baszler and Nia Jax, former tag team champions who were then broken up, and then Nia Jax was fired. She had also participated in that match. Then you have Natalya and Tamina, former tag team champions that were broken up in 2021 in the draft, and Tamina was a participant in that elimination chamber match. And for a more recent example, Nikki ASH and Rhea Ripley, former tag team champions, and now they broke up shortly after they lost them. Which, I mean, both Nikki ASH and Rhea Ripley didn't participate in the women's tag team elimination chamber match, but the fact that they still won the titles and then were broken up shortly after shows how non-existent the tag team championship scene is for the women. Also, WWE has a bit of a problem randomly pairing up women in the utmost confusing pairs. At one point, we had Charlotte Flair and Asuka were a team, and they even won the tag team champions. Not only did this make absolutely zero sense, but because like I said earlier, WWE just broke them apart shortly after they lost the titles, and it was never mentioned again. So you best believe that a video I'm going to make is why WWE should retire the tag team belts, even though they won't. But wait a minute, you're sitting there, if you're a hardcore wrestling fan, and you're thinking, well, I mean, it couldn't have been that bad as I remember it. And yeah, in the moment, a lot of it was really good, but now the ugly is really starting to rear its head. But before we can get into the ugly of the women's evolution, we must talk about the enigmas of women's wrestling that did fill the gap of the women's evolution that were not the four horsewomen. And we are going to be starting with